The first gunshot echoed through the pediatric wing of St. Mary's Children's Hospital like a thunderclap, but Sarah Martinez didn't freeze. She had been rushing toward the medication room when the sharp crack split the air, followed immediately by screaming. Her Nike sneakers squeaked against the polished linoleum as she changed direction, muscle memory from 8 years of nursing emergencies overriding every instinct that screamed at her to run the other way. The lockdown alarm hadn't sounded yet. Security was probably still trying to figure out what happened. Sarah rounded the corner by the nurse's station and saw him, a man in his 40s with wild, grief-stricken eyes and 3 days of stubble, holding a black pistol that shook in his trembling hands. He was shouting at 2 terrified medical assistants who had pressed themselves against the wall like they wanted to disappear into it. "Where is he? Where's my son? You people killed him and you just moved on like nothing happened." Behind the cowering staff, partially hidden by a privacy curtain, was the reason Sarah's heart nearly stopped. 8-year-old Tommy Chen lay on a gurney, his small body barely making a dent in the white sheets. His dark eyes were wide with terror, too frightened even to cry. Tommy was her patient, had been for 3 months now during his leukemia treatment. The chemo had left him weak, barely able to sit up on his own, let alone run from danger. Sarah didn't think. Thinking would have reminded her about active shooter protocols, about waiting for security, about the fact that she had a 12-year-old daughter at home who needed her mother alive. Instead, she stepped directly between the gunman and Tommy's gurney, her small frame creating a human shield between a loaded weapon and a sick child. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm Tommy's nurse. My name is Sarah. What's your name?" The gun swung toward her, the barrel now pointing directly at her chest from maybe 8 feet away. This close, she could see the man's hands shaking, see the tears streaming down his face, see the complete devastation in his eyes. This wasn't a monster, this was a father drowning in grief. "David," he whispered, then louder. "David Kowalski, and you people killed my boy." Recognition hit Sarah like a physical blow. 3 months ago, she had been assigned to another child in this same wing. 7-year-old Michael Kowalski, who had fought a rare blood disorder with the courage only children possess. She remembered holding this same man's hand when they removed life support. She remembered him blaming himself, asking over and over if he should have brought Michael in sooner, if he could have done something different. "Michael," she said softly. "Your son was Michael." David's eyes widened in shock. The gun wavered. You remember him?" "I remember everything about Michael. I remember how he asked for extra Jell-O even when he was too sick to eat it. I remember how he wanted to be a dinosaur scientist when he grew up. I remember how much he loved you, David. How he told me his daddy was the strongest man in the world." The silence stretched between them, broken only by Tommy's shallow breathing and the distant sound of approaching sirens. David's face crumpled, and for a moment Sarah thought he might collapse. Instead, his grip tightened on the weapon. They killed him with their mistakes, and then they acted like it was just part of the process. Like my boy didn't matter. Sarah took a small step forward, her hands visible and empty. "Michael mattered. He mattered so much. You want to know how I know? Because 3 months later, I still think about his smile. The other nurses still talk about how brave he was. We don't forget the children we lose, David. We carry them with us." Behind her, she could hear Tommy trying to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "Nurse Sarah?" She didn't turn around, couldn't take her eyes off David's face, but she reached back with one hand to touch Tommy's arm. "I'm here, sweetheart. Everything's going to be okay. I just want them to acknowledge what they did," David said, his voice breaking. "I want someone to say they're sorry. I want someone to care that my son is dead." "I care," Sarah said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I cared about Michael then, and I care about him now, and I care about you, David. This isn't what Michael would want for you." "How do you know what he would want?" The gun was still pointed at her, but David's voice had lost its edge, becoming more pleading than threatening. "Because I spent his last weeks with him. And you know what he talked about most? He talked about his daddy, and how he didn't want his daddy to be sad. He made me promise to tell you a joke if I ever saw you again." David blinked, confusion mixing with his grief. "A joke? Why don't dinosaurs drive cars?" Sarah waited a beat. "Because they're extinct." She smiled sadly. "He thought it was the funniest thing in the world. He made me practice it 3 times to make sure I got it right." For the first time since she'd stepped into this nightmare, David's face showed something other than rage and pain. The ghost of a smile flickered across his features, and the gun lowered slightly. That's such a stupid joke," he whispered. "The stupidest, Sarah agreed. But he was so proud of it. The weapon dropped another inch. David's shoulders began to shake with sobs. I miss him so much. I can't. I don't know how to live without him. I know, Sarah said, taking another careful step forward. Grief makes us do things we never thought we could do. But David, there's a little boy behind me who's fighting the same fight Michael fought. He's scared right now, but he's brave, just like your son was brave. David looked past Sarah for the first time, seeing Tommy clearly. The 8-year-old was pale from treatment, but his eyes held the same determination Sarah had seen in Michael's face. I wasn't going to hurt him, David said quickly. I would never hurt a child. When I saw him on that gurney, in the same place where Michael. He couldn't finish the sentence. I know you weren't going to hurt him. You're not a bad man, David. You're a father who's in pain. The gun was almost at David's side now. Security would be here any moment, and Sarah knew they wouldn't try to talk first. She had to end this now, before it became a tragedy that would destroy 2 more families. Can you do something for me? She asked. Can you put the gun on the floor? Not for the hospital, not for anyone else, but for Michael, because he wouldn't want his daddy to throw away his life like this. David looked at the weapon in his hand, as if seeing it for the first time. Slowly, carefully, he bent down and placed it on the floor, then kicked it away with his foot. The moment it was out of his reach, Sarah moved forward and caught him as he collapsed, his grief finally overwhelming him. I'm sorry, he sobbed into her shoulder. I'm so sorry, I just wanted someone to remember him. We remember, Sarah said, holding this broken father, while keeping one hand extended toward Tommy, who had reached out from his gurney. We all remember. 12 minutes after the first gunshot, security finally arrived to find Sarah Martinez sitting on the floor, holding a weeping man who had lost everything, while an 8-year-old cancer patient reached down from his gurney to pat the crying stranger's shoulder with a small, gentle hand. It was a moment of pure human connection that should have been celebrated as the very best of what people could be for each other in the darkest times. Instead, it would become the reason Sarah's life was about to be torn apart by the very institution she had served faithfully for 8 years. But she didn't know that yet. In that moment, surrounded by the aftermath of crisis averted and lives saved, Sarah Martinez believed she had done exactly what any good nurse would do. She believed that protecting children and showing compassion to the broken were not just part of her job, but the very reason her job existed. She was about to learn how wrong she was. Sarah Elena Martinez had never wanted to be anything but a nurse. When other kids played house or pretended to be teachers, she was always the one fixing dolls and bandaging teddy bears. Her parents, Rosa and Miguel Martinez, would find her at age 5 carefully wrapping her little brother's scraped knees with toilet paper and scotch tape, her face serious with concentration as she whispered reassurances in the mixture of English and Spanish that was the soundtrack of their East Denver home. The Martinez family lived in a small house on Colfax Avenue, where the American dream was measured not in square footage or luxury cars, but in whether there was enough money for both rent and groceries each month. Miguel Sr. worked nights cleaning office buildings downtown, coming home at dawn with stories about the important people whose desks he dusted and whose trash he emptied. Rosa cleaned houses for families in Cherry Hills Village, riding 2 buses each way to reach neighborhoods where the weekly grocery budget of her employers exceeded her monthly earnings. Neither parent had finished high school, but they possessed a PhD-level understanding of sacrifice and the unshakable belief that their children would have opportunities they never did. Every dollar was accounted for. Every luxury weighed against the cost of Sarah's and her younger brother Miguel's education. Mija, Rosa would tell Sarah as they folded laundry together on Sunday afternoons, education is the one thing nobody can take away from you. You study hard, you help people, and you make something of yourself. Sarah took those words to heart, especially the part about helping people. She was the kid who brought injured birds home for her mother to nurse back to health, who shared her lunch with classmates who had forgotten theirs, who instinctively gravitated toward anyone who seemed lonely or hurt. When Sarah was 16, everything changed. Miguel Jr., just 14 in the light of the family, began losing weight and feeling constantly thirsty. Rosa initially dismissed it as a growth spurt, but when Miguel started getting up multiple times each night to use the bathroom, she knew something was wrong. The family didn't have health insurance. Miguel's job provided the bare minimum coverage, and adding family members cost more than they could afford. So they waited, hoping Miguel would get better, trying home remedies and over-the-counter solutions while the boy grew thinner and more lethargic. By the time they scraped together enough money for a doctor's visit, Miguel Jr. was in diabetic ketoacidosis. The emergency room at Denver General was a nightmare of forms, wait times, and financial counselors who spoke in codes about payment plans and charity care. Sarah watched her parents age 10 years and 10 hours as they tried to navigate a system that seemed designed to bankrupt families like theirs. Miguel Jr. survived, but barely. The near-death experience and the crushing medical debt that followed taught Sarah harsh lessons about healthcare in America. She learned that zip codes determined access to care, that insurance status mattered more than symptoms, and that families like hers often had to choose between financial ruin and losing someone they loved. "I should have brought him in sooner," her father repeated endlessly, the guilt eating at him like acid. "I should have found the money somehow." Sarah made a promise to herself during those endless nights in the hospital waiting room. She would become someone who could help families like hers, someone who would fight for patients when the system failed them, someone who would never let a child suffer because their parents couldn't navigate bureaucracy or afford proper care. Nursing school meant working 3 jobs, cleaning offices with her father at night, tutoring kids at the community center on weekends, and stocking shelves at a grocery store whenever she could fit in extra hours. She lived on rice, beans, and whatever leftovers she could bring home from her various workplaces. Her hands were permanently stained with cleaning chemicals, and she fell asleep over textbooks more nights than she cared to count. But she graduated with honors and a specialty in pediatric nursing, determined to be the advocate she wished Miguel had had during his crisis. St. Mary's Children's Hospital hired her fresh out of school, attracted by her fluency in Spanish and her obvious dedication. For 8 years, Sarah had been the nurse families requested by name. She stayed late to read stories to scared kids, brought homemade cookies to brighten treatment days, and had a gift for explaining complex medical procedures in ways that both children and worried parents could understand. Her personal life had been a casualty of her calling. She married David Torres, a kind man who worked in construction and initially admired her dedication. But the emotional toll of pediatric nursing the children lost, the families destroyed, the system's endless bureaucratic cruelties had strained their marriage beyond repair. "You care more about other people's kids than your own family," David had said during their final fight, and Sarah couldn't deny it. She did stay late when scared children needed her. She did bring work stress home. She did prioritize her patients' needs over dinner plans and weekend trips. The divorce left her raising their daughter Isabella alone in a modest duplex, stretching her nurse's salary to cover childcare, school expenses, and the endless costs of single parenthood. Money was always tight, but Sarah never complained. She had seen real poverty, real desperation. Having a steady job that helped children was a privilege, even when it meant choosing between fixing her car and buying Isabella the name-brand shoes her classmates wore. Isabella, now 12 and wise beyond her years, understood that her mother's work was important. She did homework in hospital waiting rooms, made friends with young patients, and never complained when Sarah had to miss school events because a child was having a medical crisis. "My mom saves kids," Isabella would tell her friends matter-of-factly, with the pride that came from seeing heroism in everyday work. Sarah's parents were proud of what their daughter had accomplished, even if they didn't always understand the emotional toll it took. Rosa would bring homemade tamales to the hospital during Sarah's long shifts, charming the other nurses with stories about Sarah's childhood, while quietly assessing whether her daughter was eating enough and sleeping adequately. "You take care of everyone else, mija, but who takes care of you?" Rosa would ask, the eternal question of mothers everywhere. The truth was that Sarah took care of herself the same way she took care of everything else, with quiet determination and without complaint. She found joy in small victories: a successful treatment, a scared child's smile, parents who could finally take their healthy kid home. Those moments made the bureaucracy bearable, the low pay acceptable, and the emotional exhaustion worthwhile. 3 months before the incident with David Kowalski, Sarah had been assigned to his son Michael during the boy's final battle with a rare blood disorder. She had held David's hand during the worst moments, listened to his guilt and self-recrimination, and been present when they removed life support. Michael Kowalski wasn't the first child Sarah had lost, but each one carved away a piece of her heart. She attended his funeral, as she did for all her young patients, sitting in the back pew and grieving privately for a bright light extinguished too soon. That was the Sarah Martinez who stepped between a gunman and a gurney on that Tuesday morning in October, a woman shaped by loss and motivated by love, who believed that protecting children was not just her job, but her calling. A woman who would never walk away from someone who needed help, even if it cost her everything. She was about to discover just how much everything could cost. The interview room at St. Mary's Children's Hospital felt more like an interrogation chamber than a place where heroes should be debriefed. Sarah sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, still wearing her scrubs from the incident 6 hours earlier, facing Chief Administrator Patricia Whitmore and Risk Management Director James Hartford across a metal table that belonged in a police station, not a healing institution. Whitmore was a woman in her late 50s who had spent more years in boardrooms than patient rooms. Her steel gray hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disapproval. She wore a navy suit that probably cost more than Sarah made in a month, and a Cartier watch that definitely did. Hartford was younger but equally cold, a man who spoke in corporate buzzwords and treated human tragedy like spreadsheet data that needed to be managed and contained. His job was protecting the hospital from liability, not protecting the staff who risked their lives for patients. "Mrs. Martinez," Whitmore began, emphasizing the Mrs., though she knew Sarah was divorced. "I want you to understand that, while we appreciate your intentions, today we have serious concerns about your actions." Sarah blinked, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, concerns about what?" "You violated every protocol we have for active shooter situations," Hartford said, consulting a tablet as if reading from a legal brief. Code Silver procedures clearly state that all staff must immediately seek safe shelter and wait for security response. Under no circumstances should employees engage with armed individuals. "I saved Tommy Chen's life," Sarah said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "That man wasn't there to hurt anyone. He was grieving, and I de-escalated the situation. You endangered multiple lives by engaging with an unpredictable individual armed with a deadly weapon," Whitmore replied coldly. "You put yourself at risk. You put the patient at greater risk by drawing attention to his location, and you potentially escalated a situation that security was trained to handle." Sarah stared at them in disbelief. Security took 12 minutes to arrive. 12 minutes. In an active shooter situation, 12 minutes is an eternity. Tommy could have been killed. Other staff could have been hurt. And that poor man could have made a decision that destroyed his life forever. "That poor man," Hartford repeated with obvious distaste, "is David Kowalski, whose family is currently pursuing a multi-million-dollar wrongful death lawsuit against this hospital. His son died in our care 3 months ago, and now his attorneys will argue that our own staff members' compassionate response to him constitutes admission of guilt in their medical malpractice claim." The pieces began falling into place, and Sarah felt sick. This wasn't about protocols or safety. This was about money and legal liability. The hospital wasn't concerned that she had risked her life. They were concerned that her humanity might cost them money. "So because his family is suing you, I was supposed to let a grieving father potentially hurt himself or others?" Sarah asked. "I was supposed to watch a child die to protect your legal position? You were supposed to follow established procedures that exist for everyone's safety," Whitmore snapped. "We cannot have employees freelancing during crisis situations, regardless of outcome. What you did today, however well-intentioned, has created significant legal exposure for this institution." Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. "Michael Kowalski died from a medication error. I was there. I saw the chart reviews. Your precious institution killed that child through negligence, and now you're worried that showing basic human decency to his father might make you admit fault?" Hartford's face flushed red. "You are absolutely forbidden from discussing any aspect of patient care outside of official channels. What you just said constitutes a serious breach of confidentiality that could result in immediate termination." "The truth is a breach of confidentiality?" "Alleged truth," Whitmore corrected. "And yes, discussing patient care details with unauthorized individuals is grounds for dismissal. We've already had inquiries from media outlets about today's incident. If you so much as hint at any connection between David Kowalski's son and this institution's care, you will face both termination and legal action." Sarah realized with growing horror that she was being threatened for doing the right thing. The institution she had served faithfully for 8 years, where she had poured her heart and soul into caring for children, was treating her like a criminal for preventing a tragedy. "I don't understand what's happening here," she said quietly. "I saved lives today. I protected a child. I showed compassion to a man who had lost everything. How is that wrong?" "It's wrong because it violated protocols designed to protect everyone," Hartford said with practiced bureaucratic indifference. "It's wrong because it exposed this institution to massive legal liability. And it's wrong because it demonstrates poor judgment under pressure that raises questions about your fitness for duty." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Fitness for duty. After 8 years of exemplary service, countless commendations from families, and a spotless record, they were questioning her fitness for duty because she had prevented a potential massacre. "What happens now?" she asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to know the answer. You're being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation, Whitmore announced as if discussing the weather. You'll receive pay during the initial review period, but you are forbidden from entering hospital premises, contacting patients or families, or discussing this incident with anyone, including media representatives. Administrative leave, Sarah repeated numbly. I'm being suspended. You're being temporarily relieved of duties while we conduct a thorough review of your actions and their consequences, Hartford clarified. The investigation will include psychological evaluation to determine whether you're capable of following established procedures under stress. Psychological evaluation. They were going to claim she was mentally unstable for saving lives. Sarah felt the world tilting around her, everything she thought she understood about right and wrong, about institutions and their responsibilities, crumbling beneath her feet. There will be disciplinary hearings with both the hospital board and potentially the state nursing board, Whitmore continued. Your nursing license may be subject to review depending on the findings of our investigation. Her nursing license. They were threatening to destroy her entire career, to take away her ability to work in the only profession she had ever wanted, because she had chosen to protect a child instead of hiding in a supply closet. Mrs. Martinez, Hartford said, his voice taking on a tone that was probably meant to sound reasonable. We understand this is difficult, but you must understand our position. This hospital serves thousands of children every year. We cannot operate effectively if staff members ignore safety protocols, no matter how noble their intentions. Noble intentions, Sarah whispered. She thought about Tommy Chen's terrified eyes, about David Kowalski's broken sobs, about the weight of the decision she had made in a split second when every instinct told her to step forward instead of backward. If you had followed proper procedure, Whitmore added, security would have handled the situation appropriately, and none of these complications would exist. And Tommy Chen might be dead? Sarah said flatly. That's speculation, Hartford replied. What's not speculation is that your actions have created a legal and public relations nightmare for this institution. Sarah stood up slowly, her legs unsteady. 8 years of her life, thousands of children she had helped heal, countless families she had supported through their worst moments. And it all came down to this. She was a liability to be managed, a problem to be solved, an embarrassment to be swept under the rug. I need to go home to my daughter, she said quietly. Remember, Whitmore called after her, you're under strict confidentiality requirements. Any discussion of this matter outside official channels will result in immediate termination and legal action. Sarah walked through the hospital corridors that had been her second home for 8 years, past the pediatric ward where Tommy Chen was probably sleeping peacefully, protected by the woman who was now being punished for protecting him. Other nurses and staff members looked at her with confusion and concern, already sensing that something was wrong but not knowing what. In the parking lot, sitting in her 10-year-old Honda Civic, Sarah finally allowed herself to cry, not for herself, but for the realization that the institution she had believed in, that she had sacrificed her marriage and her financial security to serve, cared more about money than it did about the children it was supposed to heal. She drove home to Isabella through the familiar streets of Denver, trying to figure out how to explain to her 12-year-old daughter that sometimes doing the right thing gets you punished by people who have forgotten what right and wrong even mean. Sarah Martinez, who had stepped between a gunman and a gurney and lived, was beginning to understand that surviving the moment of crisis had been the easy part. The real battle was just beginning. Sarah's phone started ringing at 5:47 a.m., jolting her from the first deep sleep she'd managed since the incident 2 days earlier. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize with a 303 area code. Mrs. Martinez? This is Jessica Chen from Channel 7 News. We'd like to talk to you about the heroic actions you took at St. Mary's Hospital. Are you available for an interview this morning? Sarah hung up without answering, but the phone immediately rang again. Then again. By 6:15 a.m., there were news vans parked outside her duplex, their satellite dishes extended like mechanical flowers reaching toward the morning sky. The security footage had leaked. Someone Sarah would never find out who had provided the hospital's internal security video to a local blogger who specialized in viral content. The grainy black and white footage showed everything. Sarah stepping between the gunman and Tommy's gurney, her calm negotiation with David Kowalski, the moment he broke down and dropped his weapon, and the tender scene of her comforting both the broken father and the frightened child. By noon, the video had been viewed over 2 million times. By evening, it was trending on every social media platform with hashtags like Nurse Hero, Real Courage, and Stand with Sarah. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive. This woman is what real heroism looks like. No cape, No superpowers, just pure courage and compassion. While everyone else ran away, she ran toward danger to protect a child. Sarah Martinez is a national treasure. How is this woman not getting a medal instead of being suspended? What's wrong with our world? But the social media attention created a firestorm that Sarah was completely unprepared to handle. Her phone received hundreds of calls from reporters, talk show producers, documentary filmmakers, and podcast hosts. Donations poured into a GoFundMe account that someone had started without her permission, reaching 50-0 in the first 24 hours. The hospital's response to the viral attention was swift and tone-deaf. Chief Administrator Patricia Whitmore called a press conference for Friday afternoon, standing behind a podium decorated with the hospital's logo while facing a room packed with reporters hungry for a hero story. While we appreciate Mrs. Martinez's concern for patient welfare, Whitmore read from a prepared statement, her voice clinical and cold. We must emphasize that proper protocols exist for everyone's safety. During crisis situations, all staff members are required to follow established procedures to ensure the best possible outcomes. A reporter from the Denver Post raised her hand. Are you saying Sarah Martinez was wrong to save that child's life? We're saying that individual employees cannot make unilateral decisions about how to handle dangerous situations, Whitmore replied, her words carefully chosen by lawyers. Our security personnel are trained to manage these circumstances appropriately. But it took security 12 minutes to respond, another reporter called out. That child could have died waiting for proper protocol. Whitmore's face tightened. We are conducting a thorough review of all aspects of this incident, including response times and procedural compliance. Mrs. Martinez has been placed on administrative leave while this investigation continues. The press conference was a disaster for the hospital's public image. Video clips of Whitmore's cold, bureaucratic responses played alongside footage of Sarah's obvious courage and compassion. The contrast was stark and damning. Social media erupted with outrage. This administrator cares more about covering her ass than celebrating heroes. Shame on St. Mary's Hospital. They're punishing this nurse for doing the right thing while administrators who never touched a patient sit in judgment. This is everything wrong with healthcare. I'm never setting foot in St. Mary's again. Any hospital that punishes heroes doesn't deserve to treat children. Dr. Richard Pemberton, chairman of the hospital board and a cardiovascular surgeon with political ambitions, watched the social media backlash with growing concern. He had been planning to run for Denver City Council in the next election, positioning himself as a candidate who understood both healthcare and public safety. The negative attention surrounding Sarah's suspension was threatening his carefully crafted image. Rather than backing down, Pemberton doubled down on the hospital's position during an interview with Colorado Public Radio. We cannot have a healthcare system where individual employees, regardless of their good intentions, ignore established safety protocols, he said in his practiced, authoritative voice. What if Mrs. Martinez had been killed? What if her actions had escalated the situation and multiple people had died? We have procedures for a reason. The interviewer, Maria Santos from CPR's investigative team, pushed back. But Dr. Pemberton, the footage shows that Mrs. Martinez's actions clearly de-escalated the situation. Are you suggesting she should have let that child remain in danger? I'm suggesting that we have trained security professionals whose job it is to handle these situations, Pemberton replied smoothly. Mrs. Martinez is a pediatric nurse, not a hostage negotiator. Her primary responsibility was to her own safety and to following the protocols designed to protect everyone. Even if following those protocols meant a child could die, Pemberton's pause was just a fraction too long. We believe our protocols are designed to achieve the best possible outcomes in the maximum number of situations. It was a politician's answer, technically correct but morally hollow, and listeners heard exactly what it was. Meanwhile, Sarah remained trapped in her duplex, unable to leave without facing a gauntlet of reporters and cameras. Isabella had to stay home from school because photographers were camped outside, and Sarah's elderly parents were fielding calls from journalists who had somehow obtained their phone number. The hospital's legal team, led by Margaret Stone, sent Sarah a formal cease and desist letter threatening legal action if she spoke to any media representatives. The letter arrived by certified mail, requiring Sarah's signature and making clear that the institution she had served faithfully for 8 years was now treating her as a potential enemy. You are reminded that your employment contract includes strict confidentiality provisions, the letter read. Any discussion of internal hospital matters, patient care, or the recent incident could constitute breach of contract and grounds for immediate termination, loss of benefits, and civil liability. The threats extended beyond Sarah herself. Tommy Chen's parents, Wei and Linda, received visits from hospital administrators who reminded them about patient privacy requirements and suggested that public statements about their son's care could complicate his ongoing treatment. The message was clear. Stay quiet, or your child's medical care might suffer. But the intimidation tactics backfired spectacularly when someone leaked the hospital's legal threats to the same blogger who had originally posted the video. Screenshots of the cease and desist letter and reports of the Chen family being pressured into silence triggered a new wave of outrage. They're not just punishing the hero, they're threatening the family of the child she saved. This hospital is absolutely corrupt. Imagine being so morally bankrupt that you threaten a cancer patient's family to cover up your own incompetence. St. Mary's Hospital, where heroes get fired and families get intimidated, boycott these monsters. Local news stations began investigating the hospital's history, and what they found wasn't pretty. Over the past 3 years, St. Mary's had settled multiple malpractice lawsuits quietly, including 2 cases involving medication errors that resulted in patient deaths. The hospital had also been cited by state regulators for understaffing and inadequate safety protocols. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a young resident in the pediatric department, watched the media coverage with growing anger. She had been working at St. Mary's for 2 years and had repeatedly raised concerns about patient safety issues, only to be told that her job was to follow orders, not question policies. 3 months earlier, Dr. Walsh had been on duty when Michael Kowalski died from what she believed was a preventable medication error. She had tried to report her concerns through official channels, only to be told that the case was being handled appropriately and that further questions were unnecessary. Now she watched Sarah Martinez being destroyed by the same institutional machinery that had covered up Michael Kowalski's death, and she made a decision that would change everything. Dr. Walsh contacted Maria Santos, the CPR reporter who had interviewed Dr. Pemberton, and requested an off-the-record meeting. What she shared would blow the story wide open and reveal that Sarah's persecution was just the tip of a much larger iceberg of corruption and cover-ups. But for now, Sarah sat in her living room, watching her life being debated on television by people who had never held a dying child or comforted a grieving parent. The hero narrative was gratifying, but it felt surreal and disconnected from her reality. She wasn't a hero, she was an unemployed single mother facing legal threats from her former employer, trying to figure out how to pay next month's rent while hiding from reporters who wanted to turn her trauma into content. The police cars lined up outside her duplex the next morning would change everything, but Sarah didn't know that yet. All she knew was that doing the right thing had somehow made her a target, and the institution she had trusted to support her was working overtime to destroy her instead. The battle for Sarah Martinez's future was just beginning, and the forces arrayed against her had resources, lawyers, and institutional power that she couldn't hope to match. Or so they thought. Maria Santos had been an investigative journalist for 15 years, long enough to recognize the smell of institutional corruption from a mile away. The hospital's heavy-handed response to Sarah Martinez's heroism reeked of an organization with something much bigger to hide than protocol violations. Her meeting with Dr. Jennifer Walsh took place in a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, far from the hospital and its network of administrators who treated whistleblowers like enemies of the state. Dr. Jennifer Walsh took place in a coffee shop. Walsh was nervous, constantly checking over her shoulder, her hands shaking as she stirred her 3rd cup of coffee. "I could lose my residency for talking to you, Dr. Laus," Walsh said quietly. "But I can't watch them destroy Sarah for doing what any decent person would do, not when I know what they're really trying to cover up." Maria leaned forward, her recorder app open but hidden on her phone. "Tell me about Michael Kowalski." The story that emerged was damning. Michael Kowalski hadn't died from the natural progression of his blood disorder. He had died from a medication error, the wrong dosage of a chemotherapy drug that shut down his liver and kidneys within 48 hours. The pharmacy made the error, but it was caught during our standard review process, Dr. Walsh explained. I flagged it immediately and brought it to the attending physician, Dr. Marcus Webb. He told me to document it as a treatment complication and said the legal department would handle the rest. Did you file an incident report? I tried to. The system wouldn't let me categorize it as a medication error. Every time I selected that option, it would default back to treatment complication or patient response variable. I thought it was a computer glitch, but when I called IT, they said my access level didn't allow certain report categories. Maria's investigative instincts were screaming. Who has access to file medication error reports? Supposedly any physician. but apparently only certain physicians can actually submit them to the state database where they're supposed to be tracked. This was bigger than Sarah Martinez. This was systematic suppression of medical error reporting, which violated both state and federal healthcare regulations. What happened when you kept pushing for a proper investigation? Dr. Walsh's face darkened. Dr. Pemberton called me into his office. He said that while he appreciated my attention to detail, I needed to understand that patient care involves complex decision-making that residents aren't qualified to evaluate. He suggested I focus on my studies rather than second-guessing experienced physicians. And if you didn't focus on your studies? He reminded me that residency positions are competitive and that letters of recommendation from department heads are crucial for future career opportunities. The threat was clear: stay quiet or have your career destroyed before it started. Maria spent the next 3 days digging deeper into St. Mary's Hospital's history, using public records requests, court filings, and a network of sources she had cultivated over years of healthcare reporting. What she found was a pattern of systematic corruption that went straight to the top. Over the past 5 years, the hospital had settled 8 malpractice lawsuits quietly, paying out over $12 million in damages while admitting no wrongdoing. In every case, the settlement agreements included strict non-disclosure clauses that prevented families from discussing the circumstances of their loved ones' deaths. More disturbing were the financial connections Maria uncovered. Dr. Pemberton served on the board of PharmaCorp Industries, a pharmaceutical company that supplied many of the medications used at St. Mary's. The hospital purchased over $3 million worth of drugs annually from PharmaCorp, and Dr. Pemberton received $150,000 per year in consulting fees from the company. The medication that killed Michael Kowalski was manufactured by PharmaCorp. The dosing error occurred because the hospital pharmacy was using PharmaCorp's new simplified calculation system that had been flagged by other hospitals as potentially dangerous. But St. Mary's continued using it because Dr. Pemberton had championed its adoption as a cost-effective innovation. Margaret Stone, the hospital's chief legal counsel, had her own conflicts of interest. Her law firm, Stone Associates, specialized in healthcare defense and had represented PharmaCorp in multiple product liability cases. She was essentially being paid by both sides of any potential lawsuit involving the pharmaceutical company and the hospital. But the most damning discovery was a recorded phone conversation between Dr. Pemberton and PharmaCorp's CEO, obtained through a whistleblower at the pharmaceutical company. In the recording, made 2 weeks after Michael Kowalski's death, Pemberton discussed managing the narrative around medication errors and ensuring that individual incidents don't create systematic liability. "We need to be very careful about how errors are documented and reported," Pemberton said on the recording. "One bad case can create a pattern that plaintiffs' attorneys will exploit. It's better to handle these situations quietly through risk management than to create a paper trail that suggests institutional problems." The CEO agreed, suggesting that individual healthcare providers sometimes need to be reminded about the importance of team loyalty during difficult situations. It was a smoking gun that proved systematic cover-up of medical errors, witness intimidation, and deliberate suppression of safety reporting. Maria's investigation revealed that Sarah Martinez wasn't the first healthcare worker to be targeted for speaking truth to power. Over the past 3 years, 5 nurses and 2 residents had been forced out of St. Mary's through disciplinary actions, poor performance reviews, or hostile work environments. All had one thing in common: they had raised concerns about patient safety or questioned medical decisions that later proved problematic. The pattern was clear. Hospital leadership identified potential troublemakers, healthcare workers who put patient welfare above institutional loyalty and systematically destroyed their careers as a warning to others. Sarah's case was just the latest example, but it was also the most visible. Her viral heroism had made her impossible to disappear quietly, which was why the hospital was working so hard to discredit her publicly. If they could paint her as a rogue employee who violated protocols, they could justify their pattern of silencing dissent. Maria's investigation also revealed the depth of David Kowalski's legal battle. His lawyers had been fighting for months to get access to his son's complete medical records, but the hospital was blocking discovery through procedural challenges and delay tactics. They knew that full disclosure would reveal the medication error and the systematic failures that enabled it. David Kowalski's mental health crisis. The incident that led to Sarah's heroic intervention was directly triggered by the hospital's legal stonewalling. He had been trying for months to get answers about his son's death, only to be met with corporate lawyers who treated his grief as a liability to be managed. They told me my son died from complications of his underlying condition, David told Maria during a phone interview. But I knew something was wrong. Michael was getting better, responding to treatment. Then suddenly he was dying, and nobody could explain why. His decision to bring a gun to the hospital wasn't planned. It was the act of a man driven to desperation by institutional gaslighting and legal intimidation. I just wanted someone to tell me the truth about what happened to my boy, David said, his voice breaking. And when I saw that other child on the gurney, in the same place where Michael died, I just lost it. If Sarah hadn't been there, if she hadn't treated me like a human being instead of a threat, I don't know what would have happened. Maria realized that Sarah's story was actually 3 stories. A hero nurse being punished for saving lives, a grieving father being denied justice for his son's preventable death, and a corrupt hospital system that valued profit over patients' lives. The corruption went even deeper than medical error cover-ups. Maria discovered that hospital administrators had been manipulating infection control statistics, understaffing nursing units to increase profits, and pressuring physicians to order expensive tests and procedures that padded the bottom line while potentially harming patients. Dr. Pemberton's political ambitions were funded partly through speaking fees from medical device companies and pharmaceutical corporations that did business with the hospital. His campaign for city council was being supported by a healthcare industry PAC that represented the same companies profiting from St. Mary's questionable practices. The systematic corruption created a culture where patient safety was secondary to institutional protection, where healthcare workers were afraid to report problems, and where families seeking justice were treated as enemies to be silenced. Sarah Martinez had unknowingly stumbled into the middle of this corrupt system by doing exactly what a good nurse should do, putting patient welfare first and treating all people with compassion and dignity. Her punishment wasn't about protocol violations, it was about sending a message that the institution's interests came before everything else, including basic human decency. But Maria Santos was about to make sure that message backfired spectacularly. Her investigation was ready to publish, and it would expose not just the corruption at St. Mary's, but the broader pattern of healthcare institutions prioritizing profits over patients throughout the country. The hospital's board thought they were dealing with one problematic nurse. They were about to discover they had awakened a sleeping giant of public outrage that would consume everything they had built their careers on. The harassment started subtly, the way institutional retaliation always does, with small cruelties disguised as coincidences. Isabella Martinez Torres came home from school with tears in her eyes for the 3rd day in a row, her backpack torn and her homework scattered across the classroom floor by classmates whose parents worked at St. Lamont, Mary's Hospital, or in related medical businesses. Mrs. Patterson says my mom is a troublemaker, Isabella told Sarah, her 12-year-old voice trying to be strong but wavering with confusion. She says people who don't follow rules make everything dangerous for everyone else. Sarah's heart broke as she held her daughter, knowing that Mrs. Patterson was the mother of a boy in Isabella's class and also happened to be a nurse in the hospital's administrative offices. The woman was using children to wage war against another child, punishing Isabella for her mother's supposed crimes. The phone calls started at all hours. Anonymous voices would whisper threats before hanging up. You should have minded your own business. Heroes don't last long in this town. Watch your back, Martinez. Sarah changed her phone number twice, but somehow the callers always found the new one. Worse were the visits to her elderly parents. Rosa and Miguel Martinez, both in their 70s and confused by the media attention surrounding their daughter, received unexpected visits from men claiming to be insurance investigators. They wanted to know about Sarah's mental health, Rosa told her daughter with worry creasing her weathered face. They asked if she had anger problems, if she drank too much, if she was having financial troubles. They made it sound like they were trying to help, but something felt wrong. Sarah recognized the tactics. The hospital's legal team was building a case to destroy her character, gathering ammunition to paint her as an unstable employee whose actions couldn't be trusted. They were interrogating her family to find psychological vulnerabilities they could exploit. The most devastating blow came when Sarah received official notification that the Colorado State Board of Nursing was reviewing her license. The complaint, filed by St. Fercent, Mary's Hospital, alleged that she had demonstrated poor judgment under stress, failure to follow established safety protocols, and potential mental health instability that raises questions about patient care capabilities. Sarah stared at the letter with numb disbelief. Without her nursing license, she couldn't work anywhere in healthcare. The profession that had been her calling since childhood, the career she had built through years of sacrifice and dedication, could be stripped away by administrators who had never touched a patient. Her court-appointed legal aid attorney, Robert Chen, no relation to Tommy, was a tired man in his 50s who carried a caseload of over 200 clients and had maybe 30 minutes to devote to Sarah's case. "Look, Mrs. Martinez," he said during their brief meeting in his cluttered office, "you're fighting the entire healthcare establishment here. They have unlimited resources, the best lawyers money can buy, and political connections throughout the state. You're a single mother with no money and a compelling story that's already starting to fade from public attention. So you're advising me to give up? I'm advising you to be realistic. The state nursing board hearing is stacked against you. Dr. Pemberton plays golf with the chairman, and 2 other board members have financial ties to St. Permanixton, Mary's hospital. If you fight this and lose, you'll lose your license permanently. If you accept a censure and agree to psychological evaluation, you might be able to keep working. A censure means I admit I was wrong. It means I validate their claim that saving Tommy's life was a mistake." Attorney Chen sighed, the sound of a man who had watched too many clients get crushed by systems designed to protect the powerful. Sometimes admitting fault when you're not at fault is the price of survival in this world. But Sarah couldn't accept that logic. If she agreed to psychological evaluation and professional censure, she would be telling every other healthcare worker that standing up for patients leads to punishment. She would be validating the hospital's position that institutional rules mattered more than human lives. The pressure campaign intensified when Sarah's landlord, Mrs. Kowalski, no relation to David, informed her that the duplex was being sold and she had 60 days to move out. The timing was suspicious. The same week, Sarah's story went viral and protests began outside the hospital. Sarah quickly discovered that finding new housing was nearly impossible. Landlords who had initially seemed interested would suddenly become unavailable after running background checks that revealed her connection to the hospital controversy. Credit check companies were being told she was involved in pending litigation that made her a financial risk. Even her parents faced consequences. Miguel Sr. was informed by his cleaning company supervisor that several office buildings had requested different personnel for their accounts. Rosa lost 2 house cleaning clients who claimed they were cutting back on services but immediately hired other cleaners. The message was clear. The Martinez family's livelihood was being systematically destroyed as punishment for Sarah's refusal to back down. Isabella's school situation became unbearable when the principal, Dr. Marcus Webb Jr., son of the physician who had covered up Michael Kowalski's death, called Sarah in for a conference about her daughter's disruptive behavior. "Isabella seems to be acting out in class," he said with obviously manufactured concern. "She's argumentative with teachers, defensive about her family situation, and other students find her difficult to be around." Sarah looked at her daughter's academic record: straight A's, perfect attendance, glowing teacher evaluations, until 3 weeks ago, and realized they were creating a false narrative to isolate Isabella socially and academically. "Are you suggesting my daughter is the problem, or that other children are bullying her because of media coverage about her mother? I'm suggesting that Isabella might benefit from counseling to help her process her family's current challenges. We have an excellent school psychologist who could evaluate whether she's emotionally stable enough to continue in our regular classroom environment." The threat was subtle but clear. Submit to psychological evaluation and behavior modification, or face removal from school. That evening, Sarah found Isabella in her bedroom, carefully cutting up newspaper articles about her mother into tiny pieces. "I don't want to be a hero's daughter," Isabella said quietly. "I just want to go to school without everyone staring at me. I want my friends back. I want people to stop being mean to abuela and abuelo." Sarah held her daughter while privately making a decision that would change everything. She couldn't protect Isabella from the institutional retaliation, couldn't shield her parents from harassment, and couldn't fight a legal battle she couldn't afford to lose. But she also couldn't surrender to a corrupt system that punished people for doing the right thing. The next morning, Sarah called Maria Santos, the investigative journalist who had been documenting the hospital's corruption. "I can't give you an official interview because of the legal restrictions," Sarah said, "but I need you to know that they're not just coming after me. They're targeting my family, my parents, my daughter. If this is what happens to people who try to protect children, then other healthcare workers need to know what they're up against." Maria's investigation was about to publish, but Sarah's call added a crucial element. The story wasn't just about corruption and cover-ups, it was about the human cost of challenging institutional power. Sarah Martinez had saved a child's life and shown compassion to a grieving father. For those acts of basic human decency, she was being systematically destroyed by people who had forgotten that hospitals exist to heal, not to generate profit. But she wasn't going to surrender quietly. The nursing board hearing was coming, and Sarah was determined to tell the truth about what she had witnessed, regardless of the personal cost. If they wanted to destroy her for being a hero, they would have to do it publicly, in front of witnesses, where everyone could see exactly what kind of people punish nurses for saving children. The battle for Sarah Martinez's future was about to become a battle for the soul of healthcare itself. Officer Michael Rodriguez had been a Denver police officer for 12 years, long enough to recognize both genuine heroism and institutional cowardice when he saw them. As the first responder to St. Mary's Hospital on that October morning, he had arrived expecting to find chaos, violence, and potential casualties. Instead, he found Sarah Martinez sitting on the floor, comforting a broken man while a young cancer patient reached down to offer his own small gesture of support. Rodriguez had seen plenty of crisis interventions go wrong. He had responded to hostage situations that ended in bloodshed, domestic disputes that escalated to tragedy, and mental health crises that destroyed multiple lives. What Sarah had accomplished de-escalating a potentially deadly situation through pure human compassion was textbook crisis management that would have impressed any trained negotiator. So when Rodriguez read in the Denver Post that the hospital was disciplining the nurse who had prevented a massacre, he felt personally insulted. Sergeant Martinez, his lieutenant, called him into the office 2 days after Rodriguez gave a statement to reporters praising Sarah's actions. "We need to talk." Lieutenant Patricia Williams was a good cop and a decent person, but she was also acutely aware of the political pressures that came with managing a police unit in a city where the hospital was a major employer and Dr. Richard Pemberton was running for city council. "Mike, I appreciate that you were impressed by the nurse's actions, but your public statements are creating problems for the department," Williams said carefully. "We have working relationships with hospital security, and they're not happy that one of our officers is contradicting their version of events." "Their version of events is bullshit, Lieutenant. I was there. That woman saved lives, and they're trying to crucify her for it." "That may be true, but it's not our call to make. Hospital personnel matters aren't police business." Rodriguez felt his anger rising. "So when a citizen prevents a potential mass casualty event, we're supposed to stay quiet if her employer wants to throw her under the bus? You're supposed to stick to the facts in your reports and avoid taking sides in civilian employment disputes." The conversation ended with Rodriguez being formally counseled for inappropriate public statements and warned that future comments about the hospital situation could result in disciplinary action. But Rodriguez wasn't the only first responder who felt betrayed by the hospital's treatment of Sarah Martinez. The police union, initially supportive of administration positions, began to split when members realized they were being used to intimidate someone who had done their job better than trained professionals. Emergency medical technician Patricia Gonzalez had been in the ambulance that transported Tommy Chen to safety after the incident. She watched the 8-year-old ask repeatedly about Nurse Sarah and whether she was going to be okay. "That kid was more worried about his nurse than he was about himself," Gonzalez told her colleagues. "And now they're trying to destroy her for protecting him? That's not the healthcare system I signed up to support." The first public crack in the institutional solidarity came from an unexpected source, Tommy Chen himself. The 8-year-old, now in remission and attending art therapy sessions at the hospital, created a simple crayon drawing during his Tuesday appointment. The picture showed a woman in scrubs standing between a sad man and a hospital bed, with the words, "Nurse Sarah saved me," written in careful child's handwriting across the top. Tommy's parents, Wei and Linda Chen, had been trying to stay quiet despite pressure from hospital administrators. They understood that their son's ongoing care depended on maintaining good relationships with medical staff. But when Tommy asked why Nurse Sarah didn't visit him anymore, they realized silence was another form of betrayal. Linda Chen posted the drawing on her Facebook page with a simple caption, "My son drew this picture of the nurse who saved his life. Her name is Sarah Martinez, and she's being punished for protecting children. This is wrong." The post went viral within hours, shared thousands of times with comments that ranged from supportive to outraged. "This child understands right and wrong better than the hospital administrators. They're punishing the woman who saved this beautiful boy's life. How is this real? St. Mary's Hospital should be ashamed of themselves. This nurse is a hero." The hospital's response was swift and vindictive. Dr. Marcus Webb, Tommy's attending physician, called the Chen family for an emergency consultation about their son's continued care. "We're concerned about Tommy's emotional stability," Webb told the parents with practiced medical authority. "His fixation on the traumatic event and his apparent attachment to the staff member involved suggests he may need psychological intervention." The threat was clear. "Keep your mouth shut, or we'll claim your child is mentally unstable and needs expensive psychiatric treatment." But the Chen family's courage inspired others to speak up. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, despite threats to her residency, agreed to go on record with Maria Santos about the systematic cover-up of medical errors at St. Mary's. "I became a doctor to help people," Dr. Walsh said during her recorded interview. "But this institution has created a culture where helping people is secondary to protecting profits." Sarah Martinez embodied everything good about healthcare, and they're destroying her to send a message that loyalty to the institution matters more than loyalty to patients. The interview ran on Colorado Public Radio the same day Maria Santos published her comprehensive investigation into St. Mary's Hospital corruption. The combination created a media firestorm that hospital administrators couldn't contain. Local churches began organizing support for Sarah Martinez. Father Miguel Ramirez of Our Lady of Guadalupe, where the Martinez family had attended Mass for 20 years, dedicated his Sunday sermon to the concept of moral courage. "In our community, we have witnessed true heroism," Father Ramirez told his congregation. "A woman placed herself between danger and an innocent child, not because it was her job, but because it was right. Now she is being persecuted by those who have forgotten that healing requires compassion, not just profit." The sermon was recorded and posted online, adding religious authority to the growing movement supporting Sarah. Community organizations rallied around the Martinez family. The East Denver Neighborhood Council organized a food drive to help with expenses. Local businesses, many owned by immigrant families who identified with Sarah's working-class background, began displaying "Stand with Sarah" signs in their windows. Emma Rodriguez, a local teacher and activist, created a Facebook group called Healthcare Workers for Sarah Martinez that grew to 50 members in a week. Nurses, doctors, technicians, and support staff from hospitals throughout Colorado shared their own stories of being intimidated or punished for putting patient welfare ahead of institutional interests. "Sarah's case isn't unique," wrote ICU nurse Janet Williams from Presbyterian Hospital. "It's just the most visible example of what happens when you speak up for patients in a system that cares more about liability than lives." The group organized the first protest outside St. Mary's Hospital, with over 200 healthcare workers holding signs reading, "Heroes don't break protocol, they save lives, and compassion is not a crime." Hospital security, supplemented by private guards hired specifically to intimidate protesters, formed a barrier around the entrance. The optics were terrible armed guards protecting a children's hospital from nurses and doctors, carrying flowers and supportive signs. Dr. Pemberton's response to the growing movement was characteristically heavy-handed. He hired McKinsey Communications, a crisis management firm that specialized in reputation rehabilitation for corporations facing public relations disasters. Their strategy involved character assassination, media manipulation, and legal intimidation. They planted stories suggesting that Sarah Martinez had anger management issues and financial problems that might have affected her judgment. They threatened to sue protesters for harassment and claimed that media coverage was endangering patient care by creating a hostile environment. But every heavy-handed response generated more public outrage. When hospital administrators filed restraining orders against 3 protest organizers, including Emma Rodriguez, the local American Civil Liberties Union stepped in to provide legal representation. "This hospital is using legal intimidation to silence legitimate criticism of their handling of a heroic employee," said ACLU attorney David Martinez, no relation to Sarah. "They're trying to criminalize free speech because they can't defend their actions ethically." The restraining order hearing became another public relations disaster for the hospital when the judge, after reviewing the evidence, dismissed the hospital's petition as an obvious attempt to use the legal system to suppress constitutionally protected speech. Meanwhile, David Kowalski, despite facing his own legal challenges, reached out through his attorney to offer testimony supporting Sarah Martinez. "She saved my life that day, not just Tommy Chen's," David told Maria Santos during a follow-up interview. "I was in a dark place, consumed by grief and anger. If security had burst in with weapons drawn, I might have made a terrible decision that destroyed even more lives. Sarah treated me like a human being when I couldn't treat myself like one." His offer to testify created a legal problem for the hospital. David Kowalski was the plaintiff in a multi-million-dollar malpractice lawsuit alleging that their negligence killed his son. Having him publicly praise their employees' compassion toward him would undermine their defense strategy, which required painting him as an unstable threat rather than a grieving father seeking justice. The hospital's legal team filed motions to prevent David's testimony, claiming he was mentally incompetent due to his violent breakdown. But the motion backfired when it revealed the institution's callousness toward both the man whose son they had killed and the employee who had prevented further tragedy. By the time of Sarah's nursing board hearing, public opinion had shifted decisively in her favor. Polls showed that 78% of Colorado residents supported her actions, and 65% believed the hospital's punishment was motivated by corruption rather than legitimate safety concerns. The Stand with Sarah movement had grown from a local healthcare workers' protest into a national conversation about healthcare priorities, institutional accountability, and moral courage in the face of corrupt authority. Sarah Martinez no longer stood alone. She had become the symbol of every healthcare worker who had ever been punished for putting patients first, every employee who had ever been silenced for speaking truth to power, and every ordinary person who had ever wondered whether doing the right thing was worth the cost. The nursing board hearing would determine her professional future, but the broader movement she had inadvertently inspired would outlive whatever decision they made about her license. Healthcare workers across the country were watching, waiting to see whether institutions could still destroy people for having the courage to save lives. The Colorado State Board of Nursing hearing room had the sterile feeling of institutional judgment, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and acoustic tiles that seemed designed to muffle the sound of justice. Sarah Martinez sat at a small table, with her overworked legal aid attorney, facing a panel of 5 board members whose expressions ranged from carefully neutral to openly hostile. Across the room, St. Mary's Hospital had assembled a legal army. 3 attorneys in expensive suits flanked by a team of consultants, expert witnesses, and administrative staff who treated the hearing like a corporate acquisition rather than a professional review. Their table overflowed with documents, tablets, and the confident energy of people who had never lost a fight because they always outspent their opponents. The gallery was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds standing in the hallway outside. Nurses, doctors, healthcare workers, and community members had taken time off work to witness what many saw as a critical test of whether institutional power could crush individual conscience. Board Chairman Dr. Harold Pemberton, Richard Pemberton's uncle and a longtime St. Mary's affiliate, called the hearing to order with obvious reluctance. The national media attention had made this routine disciplinary action into a public spectacle that reflected poorly on the cozy relationships between hospital administrators and regulatory bodies. This hearing will determine whether Sarah Martinez violated professional standards in her response to a crisis situation at St. Mary's Children's Hospital, Chairman Pemberton announced. We will hear evidence from both sides and make a determination about the appropriate professional consequences. Margaret Stone, the hospital's chief legal counsel, rose to present their case with the polished confidence of someone who had destroyed careers for profit. She was immaculately dressed, her voice modulated for maximum authority, her presentation designed to make Sarah look like a dangerous rogue who endangered lives through emotional decision-making. Members of the board, Stone began. Nursing is a profession built on protocols, procedures, and systematic approaches to patient care. These standards exist not to limit individual initiative, but to ensure consistent, safe outcomes in high-stress situations. Stone clicked through a PowerPoint presentation that reduced Sarah's heroism to a series of protocol violations. Mrs. Martinez ignored established Code Silver procedures. She failed to seek safe shelter as required by hospital policy. She engaged directly with an armed individual rather than waiting for trained security personnel. Most significantly, she made unilateral decisions that put herself, the patient, and other staff members at unnecessary risk. The presentation was clinically effective, stripping all humanity from the situation and reducing it to a checklist of regulatory violations. Stone presented expert testimony from hospital security consultants who explained why engaging with armed individuals was always dangerous, regardless of outcome. The fact that this particular incident ended without physical violence, Stone continued, does not validate Mrs. Martinez's decision to ignore safety protocols. Good outcomes do not retroactively justify poor decisions. If every healthcare worker felt entitled to freelance during crisis situations, the result would be chaos and increased danger to everyone. Stone's parade of witnesses was impressive and well-rehearsed. Dr. Marcus Webb testified about the importance of team-based approaches to crisis management. Security Director James Hartford explained how Sarah's actions had compromised the institutional response and created liability exposure. Even a police crisis negotiation expert was brought in to argue that untrained civilians should never attempt to de-escalate armed situations. The hospital's case was designed to make Sarah's compassion sound like recklessness, her courage look like stupidity, and her success seemed like dangerous luck that could have ended in tragedy. Dr. Richard Pemberton took the stand with practiced political smoothness, presenting himself as a reluctant administrator forced to discipline someone he personally admired for the greater good of patient safety. Mrs. Martinez is an excellent nurse whose dedication to patient care has never been questioned, he said with manufactured regret. But healthcare institutions cannot function if individual employees, however well-intentioned, decide that their personal judgment supersedes established safety protocols. His testimony was a masterclass in political rhetoric, praising Sarah while condemning her, expressing sympathy while demanding punishment, positioning himself as the reasonable adult, making hard decisions for everyone's benefit. But the hospital's carefully constructed case began to unravel when David Kowalski insisted on testifying despite legal threats and psychiatric evaluations designed to discredit him. David took the stand wearing a simple black suit, his hands shaking slightly but his voice clear and strong. The man who had been painted as an unstable threat spoke with the quiet dignity of someone who had survived the worst thing that can happen to a parent and found meaning in unexpected compassion. "I want the board to understand what actually happened that day," David began. "I wasn't there to hurt anyone. I was there because my son died in that hospital 3 months ago from what I believe was medical negligence, and nobody would give me straight answers about what happened." The hospital's attorneys objected repeatedly, trying to prevent David from discussing his son's case, but board chairman Pemberton allowed the testimony to continue. "When I saw that little boy on the gurney in the same room where my Michael died, something broke inside me," David continued. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I was drowning in grief and anger, and I made a terrible decision to bring a weapon to a place where children are supposed to feel safe." David's voice broke as he described the moment Sarah stepped between him and Tommy's gurney. "She didn't see a dangerous criminal. She saw a father who was in pain. She talked to me about my son, shared memories of him that she didn't have to share, treated me like a human being when I couldn't treat myself like one." The hearing room was completely silent as David continued. "If security had burst in with weapons drawn, if they had treated me like the threat I appeared to be, I might have made decisions that would have destroyed more lives. Sarah Martinez prevented that by showing me compassion when I least deserved it and most needed it." His testimony was devastating to the hospital's narrative. This wasn't an unstable man making unreliable claims. This was a grieving father explaining how Sarah's courage had saved not just Tommy Chen's life, but potentially David's own soul. Tommy Chen's parents defied hospital pressure to testify next. Wei Chen, a software engineer who chose his words carefully, described watching Sarah comfort their son after the incident. "Tommy asked me why the sad man was crying," Wei testified. "I explained that sometimes grown-ups get very sad when bad things happen to people they love." Tommy thought about this, then said, "Nurse Sarah helped the sad man feel better, just like she helps me feel better when I'm scared." Linda Chen added, "Our 8-year-old understood something the hospital administrators apparently don't. That healing requires compassion, not just following rules." The Chens brought Tommy's crayon drawing as evidence, the simple picture of Sarah standing between danger and safety, with "Nurse Sarah saved me" written in a child's careful handwriting. When Dr. Jennifer Walsh took the stand, despite knowing it would likely end her residency, she transformed the hearing from Sarah's disciplinary review into an exposé of institutional corruption. "This hearing isn't really about protocol violations, Dr. 20 Sextons," Walsh testified. "It's about punishing someone who showed compassion to a man this hospital was trying to paint as a dangerous threat to avoid liability for their role in his son's death." The hospital's attorneys objected furiously, but Dr. Walsh continued, "I have documentation of systematic suppression of medical error reporting, intimidation of staff who raise safety concerns, and deliberate cover-ups of preventable patient deaths. Sarah Martinez is being destroyed not because she violated protocols, but because her humanity exposed their callousness." Officer Michael Rodriguez, despite facing disciplinary action from his own department, testified about Sarah's expert crisis management. "I've responded to hundreds of emergency situations," he said. "What Mrs. Martinez accomplished was textbook de-escalation that any trained negotiator would be proud of. The fact that she did it instinctively, from compassion rather than training, makes it even more remarkable." But the most powerful moment came when Sarah herself finally took the stand. She had refused her attorney's advice to present herself as a remorseful employee who had learned from her mistakes. Instead, she spoke with the quiet conviction of someone who understood exactly what she had done and why it was right. "I became a nurse to protect children," Sarah said simply. "When I saw Tommy Chen in danger, I did exactly what my training, my experience, and my conscience told me to do. I placed myself between a child and potential harm. The hearing room was so quiet that the hum of fluorescent lights seemed loud as Sarah continued. The hospital wants me to say I was wrong to show compassion to a grieving father. They want me to apologize for treating David Kowalski like a human being instead of a liability. They want me to admit that following their protocols was more important than saving a child's life. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she approached the heart of her testimony. If following their protocols means watching a child get hurt when I could prevent it, then I'll break their protocols every time. If showing mercy to a broken father makes me unfit to practice nursing, then I don't want to practice in a system that has forgotten why healthcare exists. The hearing room erupted in applause, forcing security to restore order. Board Chairman Pemberton threatened to clear the gallery, but the damage was done. Sarah Martinez had refused to apologize for being a hero, and everyone present understood the choice they were being asked to make. The hospital's closing arguments focused on the dangers of allowing individual emotional responses to override systematic safety measures. They painted a picture of healthcare chaos if every worker felt entitled to ignore protocols based on personal judgment. Sarah's attorney, energized by the testimony and public support, made a simple closing argument. Sarah Martinez did exactly what we want healthcare workers to do. She protected a vulnerable patient and showed compassion to someone in crisis. If that's grounds for discipline, then we've lost our way as a profession and a society. The board deliberated for 3 hours while crowds waited outside. Media crews broadcast live updates, and the entire healthcare community watched to see whether institutional power could crush individual conscience. When they returned, Board Chairman Pemberton looked like a man who had been forced to make a decision he didn't want to make. The board finds that while Mrs. Martinez's actions deviated from established protocols, the extraordinary circumstances and successful outcome of her intervention demonstrate exceptional patient advocacy that exemplifies the highest ideals of nursing practice. The room exploded in cheers as Pemberton continued. All charges against Mrs. Martinez are dismissed, and the board commends her actions as an example of professional excellence under extreme pressure. Sarah Martinez had won, but the victory felt hollow as she looked across the room at the hospital administrators, whose corruption and callousness had created this entire crisis. Clearing her name was just the beginning of a much larger battle for the soul of healthcare itself. The nursing board's decision to clear Sarah Martinez of all charges sent shockwaves through the healthcare industry, but the real earthquake came 6 hours later, when Maria Santos published her comprehensive investigation into St. Relator Mary's Hospital on the front page of the Denver Post. Culture of corruption. How St. Mary's Hospital systematically covers up medical errors and silences whistleblowers, ran across the top of the page, accompanied by a photograph of Sarah standing between David Kowalski and Tommy Chen's gurney that had become the symbol of moral courage in healthcare. The investigation revealed financial corruption, systematic cover-ups, and institutional retaliation that went far beyond Sarah's case. Maria had obtained internal documents showing that hospital administrators had suppressed reports of preventable patient deaths, intimidated families of victims into accepting settlements with non-disclosure clauses, and deliberately targeted employees who raised safety concerns. But the most damning evidence was a series of recorded phone conversations between Dr. Richard Pemberton and pharmaceutical executives, hospital board members, and legal consultants. In one particularly devastating recording, made 2 weeks after Michael Kowalski's death, Pemberton discussed strategies for managing narrative control around medical errors. The Martinez situation shows us what happens when we let employees freelance, Pemberton said on the recording. That Mexican bitch thinks she knows better than doctors, and now she's a PR nightmare because she showed compassion to a man whose family is suing us for millions. The racist comment ignited immediate outrage, but it was Pemberton's next statement that revealed the depth of institutional corruption. We need better systems for identifying problem employees before they become visible. Healthcare workers with savior complexes are dangerous to institutional stability. The recordings proved that Sarah's persecution wasn't about protocol violations, it was about eliminating employees who put patient welfare above institutional interests, with a particularly vicious edge reserved for nurses of color and working-class backgrounds who dared to challenge medical hierarchy. Within hours of the investigation's publication, protests erupted outside St. Mary's Hospital. Healthcare workers wore Stand With Sarah buttons in defiance of administrative orders. Patients and families began requesting transfers to other facilities. Major donors started withdrawing support from hospital fundraising campaigns. The hospital's board of directors, facing a public relations catastrophe and potential federal investigation, moved swiftly to contain the damage. Dr. Richard Pemberton was forced to resign in disgrace. his city council campaign imploding as recordings of his racist comments played on every local news station. Margaret Stone, the chief legal counsel who had orchestrated Sarah's persecution, faced professional sanctions from the Colorado Bar Association. Her law firm, Stone Associates, lost several major clients as corporations distanced themselves from the scandal. Chief Administrator Patricia Whitmore submitted her resignation rather than face termination, but not before issuing a statement that perfectly captured the hospital's tone-deaf arrogance. While we regret any misunderstanding about our personnel decisions, we remain committed to the highest standards of patient care and institutional excellence. The misunderstanding was the systematic destruction of a heroic nurse's career for saving a child's life. Federal investigators, prompted by the corruption evidence Maria Santos had uncovered, launched formal investigations into the hospital's Medicare and Medicaid billing practices, pharmaceutical purchasing agreements, and medical error reporting procedures. The state attorney general opened a criminal investigation into whether hospital administrators had obstructed justice by covering up preventable patient deaths. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, despite facing retaliation threats, was offered whistleblower protection by federal authorities and a residency position at Denver Health Medical Center, whose chief of staff publicly praised her moral courage in exposing institutional failures that endangered patient safety. But the most significant vindication came from an unexpected source: the hospital's own nursing staff, who organized a vote of no confidence in the remaining administration and demanded Sarah's immediate reinstatement with full back pay and benefits. Sarah Martinez embodies everything we entered healthcare to become. Read a petition signed by 247 of the hospital's 312 nurses. Her courage under pressure, her compassion for all people, and her unwavering commitment to patient welfare represent the highest ideals of our profession. We are ashamed of how our institution has treated her, and we demand immediate changes in leadership and culture. The interim board of directors, led by community members rather than medical industry insiders, offered Sarah not just her old position but a newly created role as Director of Patient Advocacy and Staff Safety, with authority to investigate concerns without administrative interference. Sarah's first official act in her new position was to implement the Michael Kowalski Patient Safety Protocol, requiring transparent reporting of medical errors, family notification of adverse events, and protection for healthcare workers who report safety concerns. David Kowalski, whose malpractice lawsuit had been quietly settled for an undisclosed amount that sources suggested exceeded $5 million, established a foundation dedicated to medical error transparency and support for grieving families navigating healthcare bureaucracy. "My son died because people prioritized institutional protection over patient safety," David said at the foundation's launch. Sarah Martinez proved that healthcare can be different when people have the courage to put patients first. Tommy Chen, now healthy and attending regular school, became an unofficial mascot for the patient advocacy movement. His crayon drawings of hero nurses were displayed in pediatric units throughout Colorado, reminding healthcare workers that their primary loyalty should be to the vulnerable people they served. The Chen family's courage in speaking up despite institutional pressure inspired other families to share their own stories of medical errors, cover-ups, and intimidation. A wave of lawsuits and regulatory complaints exposed similar patterns of corruption at healthcare facilities throughout the state. Officer Michael Rodriguez, cleared of disciplinary charges by his department after public pressure and union support, was promoted to sergeant and assigned to the police department's new Healthcare Security Liaison Unit, which improved coordination between law enforcement and medical facilities during crisis situations. Sarah Martinez taught me that real security comes from treating all people with dignity, not from following rigid protocols that ignore human complexity, Rodriguez said. She made me a better cop by showing me what courage actually looks like. The broader impact extended far beyond Colorado. Healthcare workers across the country began organizing Stand With Sarah chapters, sharing stories of institutional retaliation and demanding protection for employees who prioritized patient welfare over administrative compliance. Medical schools began incorporating Sarah's case into ethics curricula, teaching future doctors about moral courage and the importance of supporting nursing staff who advocate for patient safety. Nursing programs used her story to illustrate how professional excellence sometimes required challenging authority rather than simply following orders. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source: a letter from David Kowalski's sister, Maria, whose own daughter had been treated by Sarah 3 years earlier for a childhood cancer that was now in full remission. "You probably don't remember Isabella," Maria wrote, "but you held her hand during her first chemotherapy session when she was terrified and I was falling apart. You made her laugh by telling stories about brave princesses who fought invisible dragons. When David told me what happened at the hospital, I wasn't surprised that you stepped forward to help. That's who you've always been, someone who protects children and shows kindness to scared families. The letter reminded Sarah why she had become a nurse in the first place. Not for recognition or heroic moments, but for the quiet satisfaction of helping vulnerable people navigate their most difficult experiences with dignity and hope. 6 months after stepping between a gunman and a gurney, Sarah Martinez had not only cleared her name, but transformed the conversation about healthcare priorities, institutional accountability, and moral courage in professional settings. The corrupt administrators who had tried to destroy her were facing criminal charges, professional sanctions, and permanent damage to their reputations. The institution that had punished her heroism was under federal investigation and community oversight. The system that had prioritized liability over lives was being forced to change by regulatory pressure and public outrage. But Sarah's real victory wasn't the vindication or the new position, or even the national recognition of her heroism. Her real victory was proving that ordinary people could challenge powerful institutions and win, that doing the right thing was still possible even when the cost seemed unbearable, and that healthcare could still be a calling rather than just a business for people who remembered why they entered the profession. The morning of her return to St. Mary's Hospital, Sarah woke before dawn and sat quietly in her kitchen, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise paint the Denver sky in shades of gold and pink. Today, police cars would line her driveway in an honor salute that would bring her journey full circle from persecution to recognition. But more important than any ceremony was the knowledge that she would return to work in a transformed institution where patient advocacy was protected, medical errors were reported transparently, and healthcare workers who showed moral courage were supported rather than silenced. Sarah Martinez had stood between a gunman and a gurney and lived. More than that, she had stood between a corrupt system and vulnerable patients, and won. The morning of Sarah Martinez's return to St. Mary's Children's Hospital dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of Colorado sunshine that made the Rocky Mountains look close enough to touch. Sarah woke at 5:30 a.m., not from anxiety or insomnia as she had for months, but from the peaceful anticipation of returning to work she loved at an institution that had finally remembered its purpose. Isabella found her in the kitchen, standing at the window with her coffee, still in her pajamas but already wearing the quiet smile that meant her mother was genuinely happy. "Are you nervous, Mom?" Isabella asked, pouring herself orange juice and settling at the small kitchen table where they had shared so many difficult conversations over the past months. "A little," Sarah admitted. "But it's the good kind of nervous, like when you're about to do something you've been waiting for." "I'm proud of you," Isabella said with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a 12-year-old who had watched her mother survive institutional persecution and emerge stronger. "Not because you're famous or anything, but because you didn't give up on being good when being good got you in trouble." Sarah sat across from her daughter, struck by how much Isabella had grown during their ordeal. The girl had lost friends, faced harassment at school, watched her grandmother and grandfather suffer because of her mother's choices, and never once asked Sarah to back down or apologize for doing the right thing. "I learned something from you too, Mija," Sarah said. "I learned that courage isn't something you have or don't have. It's something you choose, again and again, especially when it would be easier to choose something else." At 6:45 a.m., Sarah opened her front door to get the newspaper and stopped in amazement. Police cars lined both sides of her street as far as she could see: patrol units, unmarked detective cars, motorcycle officers, and even a police helicopter circling overhead with the Channel 7 news crew broadcasting live. Officer Michael Rodriguez, now Sergeant Rodriguez, stood at attention next to his patrol car directly in front of Sarah's duplex. Behind him, dozens of officers in dress uniforms formed an honor guard that stretched down Colfax Avenue. "What is this?" Sarah asked, stepping onto her porch in her bathrobe, her hair still unbrushed, completely unprepared for the ceremony unfolding on her quiet street. "Ma'am," Sergeant Rodriguez said with the formal respect reserved for genuine heroes, "the Denver Police Department would like to escort you to work this morning, if that's acceptable." Sarah looked down the street at the assembled officers, men and women who had volunteered their time to honor a nurse who had done their job better than many trained professionals. Some were first responders who had arrived at the hospital that October morning. Others were officers who had followed her story and felt personally inspired by her courage. "I don't understand," Sarah said, though she was beginning to cry despite herself. "You prevented what could have been a mass casualty event," Rodriguez explained. "You showed us what real community policing looks like, treating every person with dignity, de-escalating through compassion, and putting public safety above personal safety. We wanted to say thank you. As Sarah went inside to dress quickly in her nursing scrubs, the same blue uniform that had become a symbol of healthcare heroism, neighbors emerged from their houses to watch the unprecedented display of respect. Mrs. Chen from next door brought coffee for the officers. The Rodriguez family across the street set up folding chairs on their front lawn like they were watching a parade. When Sarah emerged 20 minutes later, she found that the honor guard had grown. Tommy Chen sat in the passenger seat of Rodriguez's patrol car, healthy and grinning, wearing a junior police badge that the officers had pinned to his Denver Broncos jersey. "Nurse Sarah," Tommy called out, his voice carrying the pure joy of a child who had survived cancer and lived to see his hero vindicated. "I get to ride with you." David Kowalski stood beside the patrol car, wearing a simple black suit and carrying a sign that read, "Heroes don't follow bad rules, they follow their hearts." His presence was both unexpected and deeply meaningful, the grieving father who had become an unlikely symbol of redemption and forgiveness. "I wanted to be here," David told Sarah as she approached the car. "What happened that day? What you did for me and for Tommy, it changed everything. Not just for us, but for everyone watching." The procession to St. Mary's Hospital became an impromptu celebration of community values and moral courage. Police cars with lights flashing but sirens silent escorted Sarah's patrol car through neighborhoods where people lined the sidewalks holding homemade signs. "Welcome back, hero." "Thank you, Nurse Sarah," and "Courage is contagious." At traffic lights, other drivers rolled down windows to applaud. Construction workers on scaffolding stopped their work to wave. Even the morning commuters who might normally be annoyed by traffic disruption seemed to understand they were witnessing something important. The Denver Fire Department had positioned ladder trucks at major intersections, their extended ladders displaying American flags that fluttered in the morning breeze. Emergency medical services crews stood beside their ambulances at hospital corners, offering their own professional salute to a colleague who had embodied the best of emergency response. As the procession approached St. Mary's Hospital, Sarah could see that the building itself had been transformed. The institutional coldness that had characterized her departure was gone, replaced by banners reading, "Welcome home, Sarah," and "Patient advocacy starts here." Hundreds of people crowded the hospital entrance, nurses and doctors in scrubs, families of current and former patients, community members who had followed her story, and healthcare workers from other institutions who had driven from across the state to witness her return. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, now completing her residency at Denver Health but present for the ceremony, held a banner signed by pediatric patients. "Thank you for protecting kids." The simple message, written in children's handwriting and decorated with crayon drawings, captured the essence of why Sarah's story had resonated so powerfully. The new interim hospital board, led by community representatives rather than medical industry insiders, had arranged for the ceremony to take place in the hospital's main atrium. The same space where Sarah had been interrogated and threatened 6 months earlier was now decorated with flowers, banners, and photographs of the healthcare workers who had supported her throughout the ordeal. Hospital CEO Dr. Patricia Chen, no relation to Tommy's family, a pediatric surgeon who had been recruited specifically to restore the institution's reputation and mission, welcomed Sarah with words that acknowledged both her heroism and the systematic failures that had led to her persecution. "Sarah Martinez represents everything this hospital should aspire to become," Dr. Chen said to the assembled crowd. "Her courage under pressure, her compassion for all people in crisis, and her unwavering commitment to patient welfare will guide our institutional culture going forward." The ceremony included the unveiling of the Sarah Martinez Patient Advocacy Center, a new department dedicated to supporting families navigating medical crises and protecting healthcare workers who raised safety concerns. The center's mission statement, written in both English and Spanish, was simple. Every patient deserves an advocate, and every advocate deserves protection. But the most meaningful moment came when Tommy Chen, now cancer-free and thriving, presented Sarah with a new crayon drawing. This one showed her in her nursing scrubs surrounded by children of all colors and backgrounds, with the words, "Real heroes help everyone," written across the top. "I made this for your new office," Tommy said with 8-year-old seriousness. "So you don't forget that kids need nurses who are brave enough to help them when scary things happen." Sarah knelt down to hug the boy whose life she had protected, thinking about the journey that had brought them both to this moment. 6 months ago, she had stepped between danger and innocence without thinking about consequences or recognition. Today, that split-second decision had become a symbol of moral courage that inspired people across the country. "I won't forget," she promised Tommy, and meant it. As the formal ceremony concluded, and Sarah prepared to begin her first day as Director of Patient Advocacy and Staff Safety, she walked through the pediatric ward where her career in heroism had begun. The hallways were filled with flowers, cards, and gifts from families whose children she had helped over the years. In room 312, where Tommy Chen had recovered from his cancer treatment, a small plaque now marked the spot where Sarah had stood between a gunman and a gurney. Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Sarah paused at the plaque, remembering the weight of that moment when time seemed suspended and the only choice was between stepping forward or stepping back. She had stepped forward because a child needed protection, a grieving father needed compassion, and her conscience gave her no alternative. The cost had been enormous months of unemployment, legal threats, harassment of her family, and the painful discovery that institutions could be corrupt enough to punish employees for saving lives. But the victory had been even greater. The transformation of an entire healthcare system, the inspiration of countless other healthcare workers, and the proof that ordinary people could challenge powerful corruption and win. As Sarah began her rounds in her new role, she carried with her the lessons learned from standing between a gunman and a gurney. She had learned that true authority came from service rather than title, that moral courage was contagious when people saw it in action, and that healthcare could still be a calling rather than just a business for those who remembered why the profession existed. The police cars had departed, the cameras had been packed away, and the crowds had returned to their daily lives. But the change Sarah Martinez had created would endure in every healthcare worker who now knew that patient advocacy was protected, every family who could navigate medical crises with proper support, and every child who would be cared for by nurses who understood that courage was part of the job description. That evening, Sarah returned home to Isabella and her parents, who had prepared her favorite meal of tamales and rice to celebrate her return to work. As they sat around the small kitchen table, where they had weathered so many storms together, Rosa Martinez raised her glass of agua fresca in a toast. "To my daughter," Rosa said, with the pride that came from watching someone she loved choose principles over convenience, "who taught us all that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to walk away when someone needs help." Sarah looked around the table at the faces of people who had supported her through the worst months of her life, people who had never asked her to compromise her values or apologize for doing the right thing. These were her real rewards, not the ceremonies or recognition, but the knowledge that she had remained true to the promises she made when she became a nurse. "I would do it again," Sarah said quietly. "Every single time. Because that's what nurses do, we stand between people and harm, whatever form that harm takes." Outside, the Denver evening sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the same colors that had welcomed her home that morning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in her role as patient advocate, new opportunities to protect vulnerable people from institutional indifference, and new chances to prove that healthcare could still be about healing rather than profit. But tonight, Sarah Martinez, who had stood between a gunman and a gurney and lived, who had faced down institutional corruption and won, who had chosen courage when courage seemed impossible, simply sat with her family and enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of coming home to work that mattered. The police salute had been an honor she would never forget. But the real victory was in knowing that she had kept faith with the scared 16-year-old girl who had promised her dying brother that she would become someone who protected children when systems failed them. She had kept that promise, and in keeping it, had reminded an entire nation what heroism actually looked like.